First of all, thank you all for attending our 5th session, Animals as Drivers of Climate Change, of our webinar series, Animals, Climate Change and Global Health. We're more than excited that so many people are attending this session. Thank you for your interest and for taking the time. So today we have talks by 3 fantastic panelists with a broad range of expertise, and we're more than thrilled to have Josh Milburn moderate this session. So to quickly introduce Josh, Josh is presently a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Sheffield. And there he's undertaking a research project on food justice and animals. Josh's expertise is in philosophy, and his research concerns political philosophy, animal ethics, and the philosophy of food. Josh is also a member of the Research Advisory Committee of the Vegan Society, and very interesting for many of you, a section editor at the journal Animals and Politics, Politics and Animals, my apologies. So Josh, we very much look forward to seeing how you choose to navigate this complex topic among the speakers. Thank you so much for being here today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for that introduction, and hello everyone, welcome to this session. Thanks so much for joining us for this event. I'm really hopeful it's going to be a really interesting event. Indeed, already there's been a bit of conversation about the title of this event, Animals as Drivers of Climate Change. So some people have said, well, shouldn't that be perceptions of animals as drivers of climate change, or constructions of animals as drivers of climate change? And I think these are really interesting questions, right? And I think we're going to see our speakers take a range of different approaches here, and then we're going to open up the floor and we're going to explore these questions together. So as has been said, my name's Josh. I work at the University of Sheffield, but I'm not going to say too much about myself because, you know, you're not here to hear about me. I'm sure you'd much rather I just got on with introducing our speakers. So we've got 3 speakers this evening. The first is Natalie Khazaal, second is Sebo, and the third is Marina Bolotnikova. Now, I'll introduce Jeff and Marina properly a little bit later, but I just wanted to quickly do a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to have our 3 presentations, one after another, and after that, we're going to have a much more open discussion session. So as you will see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A box and a chat box. Now, those of you who are not already involved with the event, i.e. one of the speakers or organisers, you can't type in the chat box, but you can type in the Q&A box. So you're very welcome to leave questions for our panellists as we go. Now, we'll have all of our questions and conversation at the end, but hopefully we'll be able to get to many of those questions, and I'll certainly be aiming to get to as many of those questions or comments as possible for talking points among the panelists. Just to repeat, all those questions will be at the end. We'll have the presentations one after another. So, without any further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. That's Dr. Natalie Khazaal. She's an assistant professor at Georgia Institute of Technology and an American Council of Learned Societies fellow. She studies the links between disenfranchisement, media and language. She's a co-editor of Like an Animal, Critical Animal Studies Approaches to Borders, Displacement and Othering, which was published this year, 2020, by Brill. And she's the author of Pretty Liar, Television, Language and Gender in Wartime Lebanon, which was published in 2018 by Syracuse University Press. And she's the founding faculty advisor for No Lost Generation Texas, which is a student initiative for global refugee and migrant crisis relief efforts. So I hope you'll all join me in welcoming Natalie, and I will hand over the floor to her now.
Thank you very much, Josh, and thank you to the organizers of these wonderful series of panels. Dr. Blattner, would you please put the poll? I would ask all the participants, participants in the audience to please answer the poll that Dr. Blattner is going to put on your screens, and you will have about half a minute to a minute to answer that before I can proceed. Okay, so we see the results with cows. 82% of the participants voted that cows are farmed to produce the most amount of greenhouse gases. And are we headed for a meatless revolution? The division is 60% to 40% no. 60% yes to 40% no. Thank you to everybody who voted, or who participated in the poll. I am going to step today outside of my field of cultural studies and talk about, in general terms, the link between pandemics, global warming, and loopholes for animal agriculture. I'm going to start with the question: how do certain agricultural practices position a number of animal species as drivers of pandemics and climate change through breeding, farming, and slaughter? So humans didn't have viral diseases until about 11,000 years ago, when we began farming other animals. But there is one group of humans who didn't have these infectious diseases at all and didn't die of the inevitable pandemics. These are pre-Columbus Native Americans, because they never farmed other animals. Through farming, we got measles from cows and sheep, and in the last 150 years alone, this has killed over 200 million humans. We also got smallpox from farming camels, whooping cough from farming pigs, typhoid fever from farming chickens, and influenza from farming ducks, leprosy from farming water buffalo, and the common cold from farming horses. So these are the results of classical or traditional animal farming. But since the 1970s, we're in the midst of an unprecedented age of these kind of new global plagues or pandemics. This period coincides also with the establishment of intensive captive production farms that abduct and farm free living animals. It's a kind of a bushmeat trade, and in particular, eating apes from that bushmeat trade is the cause of the Ebola and HIV infections in humans. Until 2017, from the beginning of HIV, infection until 2017, we have about 35 million humans who have died from HIV. And this virus affects 1 in 4 adults in many African countries. Wet markets, which also sell a type of, exotic, quote unquote, flesh, has brought us the bird flu, as well as SARS, and now COVID-19. So if the fact that classical traditional animal farming and these wet markets brought us a long list of infectious diseases were not enough, family farms, the old-fashioned family farms, have now turned into CAFOs, or concentrated animal feeding operations. And these dark, wet, musty, filthy, cramped places create just the ideal ground for super spreading known virus strains, and especially for their mutation into new, potentially deadlier strains. No surprise that slaughterhouses became a major COVID-19 hotspot, with a significant number of infections going back to single slaughterhouses like Smithfield or Tyson Foods. Long before COVID-19, many scholars predicted that animal agriculture would be the most likely epicenter of the new pandemic. But animal agriculture is also a major cause of most of the world's critical challenges, such as climate change, chronic disease, antibiotic resistance, deforestation or species extinction. We're on a trend today to exceed twice the maximum temperature rise of under 2 degrees Celsius to which we committed in Paris. What's going on? Most efforts on combating the climate catastrophe are focused on CO2 created in the fossil fuel industries. Animal agriculture has evaded similar observation or dedication, although it also produces CO2, although in much smaller amounts. However, it is a huge producer of methane and nitrous oxide. Methane is a bigger threat than CO2 because it has a greater global warming potential. And while most conservative estimates put animal agriculture at 15% of total greenhouse gas production, some scholars put it at about 1/4 of all greenhouse gases. So the portion of greenhouse gases that come from animal agriculture is a major factor in this trend toward exceeding the maximum 2 degrees, below 2 degrees Celsius temperature rise. And even if we were to dismantle CAFOs, animal agriculture would still create conditions for global pandemics and send us over the cliff on global warming, because the demand for meat is increasing constantly, especially in developing countries where incomes are rising. In 2019, I attended a talk by an NGO on climate change and activism in Christchurch, New Zealand. And in the Q&A, I pointed out that the speaker didn't mention eating meat as one of the major contributors to global warming. She agreed, but she said that mentioning this would make the audience uncomfortable. We are weighing the future of the planet as if it were the witch from the Monty Python movie, where the accused woman miraculously didn't weigh much more than a smaller duck. So this response reflects this typical choice many make. They can sacrifice the planet to save their taste for meat. Carnism is the ideology of eating a non-human animal flesh. It's an aspect of the broader form of prejudice we call speciesism, or the moral disregard of other animals. Most humans have brain wiring that allows them to see how animal agricultural practices inflict suffering on non-human animals. And humans engage in a number of defense mechanisms that make non-human suffering invisible to avoid dealing with the moral implications of harming and killing non-human animals. For example, neglecting or minimizing how animal agriculture is a major cause of global warming and pandemics. This protects human economic interest in the short term. It makes it more difficult to address long-term damage related to complicated issues like global warming, and is fundamentally framed by the ideology of carnism. So what legal loopholes emerge from agricultural exceptionalism that shield these agricultural practices from criticism and change? And do short-term economic interests, our inability to grasp long-term systemic consequences, or at least the broader publics, and also mobilizing the ideology of carnism, do these create a space of exceptionalism for animal agriculture? Well, first of all, agencies responsible for protecting consumers are typically also the agencies promoting meat sales. And lobbyists or former lobbyists are also in control of regulation, which is a conflict of interest. So that's a type of exception, or kind of a loophole. The laws on the books supposed to protect animals are often a way to comfort the public, but because of many loopholes, regulation is insufficient or absent. In 2015, US Congress renewed a law that prevents the Environmental Protection Agency from requiring emission reports from animal agriculture. 41 other sectors submit these reports regularly, so the meat industry is the only major source of greenhouse gas emissions excluded from reporting its own emissions. Multiple studies have found that greenhouse gas emissions from animal agriculture are twice as bad as what the EPA estimates. That's not a small figure, since the US animal agriculture industry is the number two largest in the world. And politicians and even environmental groups don't talk much about it because they're afraid of a backlash from a meat-loving public. Earlier, I mentioned that the conservative figure of greenhouse gases from animal agriculture is 15%. That figure is an underestimate because of underreporting with the EPA, but also because it omits the majority of emissions related to feed production, like fertilizer use, energy, and transport. For instance, a study found that animal products provide 70% of our energy consumption. On the regulation side also, there aren't enough inspectors to put a meaningful oversight. For instance, the average slaughterhouse would get an inspection of about once a year, and after they get it, they are reasonably comfortable that for a whole year, they won't be inspected again. And so oversight here is impotent, and it constitutes a type of exception. Another loophole is the US Animal Welfare Act that protects all animals except those in animal agriculture, who are the vast majority of mammals, as their numbers far exceed free living mammals, for instance. But animal agriculture also punishes its critics. It successfully lobbied to pass the ag-gag laws in the US. These laws silence and punish any whistleblower or member of the public who documents cruelty on factory farms. So factory farms are able to conceal their standard practices. Another unfair advantage animal agriculture receives is government subsidies. They artificially boost supply and de facto constitute unfair competition because other businesses are not subsidized. Recently, the US National Cattlemen's Beef Association reported a rise in sales since 2015 and an all-time peak in 2019. Because subsidies drive down cost and bring up demand, the rise in meat sales is expected to continue. Plant-based meat alternatives like Impossible Foods, which are not subsidized, then need to cut their prices to be competitive. So recently, Impossible Foods announced a 15% cut. Impossible Foods competitor Beyond Meat also proceeded to announce their intention to cut their prices. And in terms of exception and exceptionism, we can also talk about distracting the public as a way of providing this space of exception. In 2002, Republican pollster Frank Luntz wrote a memo to the Bush administration where he said that it's time for us to start talking about climate change instead of global warming because global warming is much more scary. We think in frames such as climate change or global warming, and these frames are directly connected to the emotional regions of our brains. Because political ideologies use these frames and systems of frames, they activate our circuitry and normalize the ideological frame with each repetition. The consequence is really to distract and to confuse the public. Earlier studies like the World Watch Institute put greenhouse gas emissions from animal agriculture at 51%, but later, and probably with the help of the movie Cowspiracy that used this study, a number of scientists disputed it, arguing that it was only 14.5%. So the lack of scientific consensus really confuses the public. But the fact that lower figures disregard many processes like land use change that are part of animal agriculture or use different time scales, this is a sign of just how deeply rooted ideological frames are. A recent study that examined the greenhouse gas impact of different foods found that half of the public thought animal agriculture doesn't harm the planet if it's done properly. Even worse, national guidelines also recommended foods with very high greenhouse greenhouse gas emissions like dairy as really good healthy foods. Despite the overwhelming scientific evidence of the high impact of animal agriculture on global warming and pandemics, the industry portrays itself and portrays carnism as a victim under threat. On the scientific side, many scientists ignore carnism as a fundamental cause of climate change and pandemics and instead focus on optimizing animal agriculture. One case in point are a number of studies calling for shifting meat consumption from cows to other species. And like the majority of our audience today voted in the poll, yes, cows and cow milk are topping the species that are farmed to produce the most amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So cows belch methane produced in their multi-chamber stomachs, and because they're farmed to be by the billions, more than a billion, their farming causes the highest greenhouse gas compared to other animal farming practices. Some studies then argue that animal agriculture should switch to non-ruminants like pigs and poultry because as animals with a single-chambered stomach, they're responsible for lower methane emissions. Or they argue that cow biology should be changed with an anti-methane vaccine. One study, for instance, proposed creating environmentally and I'm quoting, environmentally and climate smart, economically viable, sustainable animal agriculture in a changing climate in Africa and beyond. And the study also said that this could be done by using, and again, I'm quoting, Charles Darwin's Origin of Species and the theory of natural selection and evolutionary biology, where a grain in the balance will determine which individual shall live and which shall die. So clearly biopolitics provide here the framework for these kinds of scientific papers. The latest example with the wet markets in China has inspired a new attempt to protect animal agriculture and blame the pandemic on ethnic, quote unquote, Chinese practices, attributing pandemics to minoritized human groups or to conspiracies like evil scientists who consciously create deadly viruses in labs, confuses and tires the public and protects in the end carnism and animal agriculture. Well, here we should, really answer the question, what are the potential existential risks posed by animal agricultural practices and their protection? The greatest risk comes recognizing carnism as an ideology that shields destructive, cruel practices like animal farming and pushes humans to choose inadequate solutions to runaway global warming and therefore risk extinction. For instance, shifting from one farmed animal species to another won't give us adequate results in terms of curbing greenhouse gas emissions because of rising demand for meat, especially in developing countries. The global demand for farmed animals is expected to rise by 60-70% in the next 10 years alone. And because of growing demand for meat, technological and management improvements in animal farming will only reduce emissions by around 10% of the potential greenhouse gas produced in animal farming. Without any mitigation, by 2030, studies found that 27 to 49%, about up to a half of the emissions budget, could be spent on the emissions from animal agriculture. And if animal agriculture is not forced to become transparent and to change, other sectors would have to reduce amounts they just can't reach to cope with the runaway global warming. So leading up to a potential collapse in the human species if global warming becomes, so high, there would be chaos from hurricanes, increased desertification, wildfires, and all these will ravage society. They will cause food shortages, much more competition for resources, large migrant populations. Even though some human groups will be the winners, while other groups will be the losers, in the adaptation to the warmer, stormier climate, it's still immoral to gamble with such damage. And politically, we risk that with such challenges to the environment, we will see the election of a lot more and more often populist leaders like Trump and Bolsonaro that immediately after being elected start burning forests for farmland. We can also see science denial. We can see conspiracy theories. We might soon be even out of funds to fight global warming. So unless we urgently do something, we are really going to destroy the planet. In this kind of scenario, how can veganism combat greenhouse gases? Mainly the reduction of methane is going to come into play by switching from meat to plant protein, and that will bring the quickest results, achieving significant reduction in warming in a relatively short time. It could reduce food-related greenhouse gases by 70% globally by 2050. A plant-based vegan diet is also the most efficient use of planetary resources, including land, water, energy, and it results in lower, of course, greenhouse gas emissions. For instance, beans produce 46 times less greenhouse gases compared to cow meat when we keep the protein equivalent. According to one 2017 study, if we substitute cow meat with beans, it could lower emissions in the US up to 75% of our target for 2020 and free the land that is equivalent, 1.5 times equivalent of the size of the state of California. And it could also feed a second US population of 350 million. Switching to plants will increase global security, and it would even bring net negative greenhouse gases. For instance, one study showed that if the UK cut meat consumption in half, it would make only 1/5 of the greenhouse gases it made back in the 1990s. I will stop here and just again bring up the results from the poll with more than half of the audience who are participating in our session today thinking that we are headed for a meatless revolution. I hope that this really happens and that this really is going to solve not only the global pandemics and global warming, but also address other issues such as cruelty and ethics. Thank you very much. I give the I guess the screen back to Josh Milburn.
Great, thanks so much, Natalie. And thanks so much everyone who is typing in questions in the Q&A box. As I say, we will get to those later on, but it's great to see so many interesting talking points already coming up. So I'm going to now introduce Jeff Sebo, who is our second speaker. Jeff Sebo is a clinical associate professor of environmental studies and is an affiliated professor of bioethics, medical ethics and philosophy, and is the director of the Animal Studies MA program at New York University. He works primarily in bioethics, animal ethics and environmental ethics. and he's the co-author, one of many co-authors, of Chimpanzee Rights, which was published by Routledge in 2018, and one of two authors of Food, Animals and the Environment, which was also published by Routledge in 2018. And he's the sole author of Animals, Pandemics and Climate Change, which is forthcoming with Oxford University Press. He's also a board member at Animal Charity Evaluators, a board member at Mining Animals International, that's Minding Animals International, apologies, and an executive committee member at the Animals and Society Institute, and more, he's a senior fellow at Sentient Media. So someone who's very involved with a lot of these organizations, exploring animal activism and the links with academia. So I'm very happy to hand over the floor or the screen or whatever it may be to Jeff.
Great. Thank you so much, Josh, and thank you to the organizers for, again, organizing this fantastic webinar series and this session in the webinar series. And thanks to Natalie for your fantastic talk. And I also wanted to mention for everybody listening that since Josh decided not to introduce himself and say anything about himself, he also is doing a lot of great work on these issues, on animal ethics and on the ethics of plant-based and cultivated meat. And you can check out a piece that he published on cultivated meat in The Conversation just this past week, in case anybody has any interest. So this session is about animals as drivers of climate change, which is a stand-in for human exploitation and extermination of non-human animals as drivers of climate change, and the questions that raises for the ethics of food production and consumption and activism and advocacy. What kind of food system should we attempt to build, and how can and should we attempt to get from here to there, and what kind of role, if any, should currently farmed animals and wild animals, etc., play in these future food systems and in the path from here to there. So my role in the conversation is to say a little bit about what kind of future food system we should be aiming to build and how we can get from here to there. And obviously this is a vast topic, and I am not going to try to get to the bottom of any particular issue. Instead, with apologies for my doorbell, instead I am going to try to speak in broad general terms about a few different tensions or conflicts that can arise in these discussions, and how I think that we can navigate these conflicts gracefully so that we can build coalitions and do real effective food activism and advocacy. So there are, of course, many things that we can agree about. We can agree that our current industrial animal agricultural system is horribly inhumane, unhealthful, unsustainable. We are killing an estimated 100+ billion non-human animals a year in farms, an estimated 1 to 3 trillion non-human animals a year in the oceans, and then of course, consuming a vast amount of land and water and energy and producing a vast amount of waste and pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, increasing the risk of global health and environmental threats like pandemics and climate change. So this is clearly a terrible system, arguably one of the worst things humans have ever done, and we need to change it. So hopefully we can agree with many people about that. However, many people, including within the animal and environmental movements, disagree about what the goals should be and what the path should be towards those goals. So let me offer some examples. And my discussion of these examples is really going to emphasize a general theme that I think pervades these discussions and debates, which is that when we are thinking about where to go and how to get there, it can be very tempting to engage in simplistic and reductive and single issue thinking about these questions. And we should really reject that in favor of a much more complex, rigorous, systematic, holistic, structural, multi-issue approach to thinking about these issues. And when we do that, when we get rid of either or thinking and we replace it with both and thinking, we can make a lot more progress together than we otherwise might. So consider, for example, debates that often happen about what kind of food system we should be aiming for. Many people debate between abolitionist and regulationist ideals. Some people think that we should abolish our current food system and replace it with an alternative food system. And other people think that we should merely regulate our current food system so that it adheres to especially high, rigorous ethical standards. And this debate can often be framed as though these positions are really far apart from each other. And if you accept one or the other, you have a radically different vision for what a future food system might look like. And of course, that might be true of many people who accept these labels and these visions for the future. But I think a reasonable charitable interpretation of both might reveal that they can be a little bit closer together than we might have initially expected. So think about abolition for a second. Abolition can come in different kinds and different degrees, depending on which aspects of the food system you want to be abolishing and replacing with alternatives. For example, our current food system not only uses animals, but also uses some industrial methods, also uses global trade, also uses some synthetic and some natural food sources. Are we aiming to abolish all of these features of our current food system, or only some of these features of our current food system? I think a lot of people who support getting rid of factory farming, getting rid of industrial animal agriculture, might think on reflection that we should preserve some other aspects of our current food system. For example, in a world with 8 billion humans, in 2050, there will be 9 or 10 billion. By 2100, there might be 10 or 11 billion humans. We might need some aspects of industrial food production and global trade in order to efficiently and effectively feed the world healthful, affordable food at scale. And so we might think that we should preserve at least some aspects of our current system, even if we seek to overthrow many other aspects. Similarly, on the regulation side, it might be that some people think that what we should do is regulate our current food system, but given how many harms our current food system is causing and how severe those harms are, and how baked into the proper functioning of this system these harms are, what we discover when we look into it is that if we really do tax, redistribute taxes and subsidies, regulate, etc., the current food system so that it adheres to ethical standards that any reasonable person would regard as appropriate, what we discover is the current system is fundamentally economically unsustainable. The only way factory farming works in a free market is if you heavily subsidize it, if you allow it to externalize all sorts of welfare and health and environmental costs, and if you let it be deregulated so that it can do terrible things to animals and workers and local communities without any liability. And once you start to close all that up and actually subsidize it less and force it to pay for the health and environmental harms that it causes and treat workers well and treat animals well, all of a sudden it turns out that this is not going to be competitive on the open market. And so on the regulation side, what we learn is that any food system that adheres to any set of standards that reasonable person would regard as acceptable is going to have to involve the use of, at the very least, many fewer animals. And so the range of reasonable positions here is, I think, a future food system that maybe retains some elements of our current food system, like industrial and globalized production and distribution to a degree, while getting rid of animals as being at the center of our food system as resources that can be exploited and exterminated as we see fit. There is no reasonable set of options, I think, that is going to allow animals to remain at the center of our food system, even if you think they can still have a place, which can be debated. So while it can be tempting to frame these debates about goals in terms of abolition versus regulation, and then we can disagree with each other and see each other as really far apart, I think that when we drill down, we realize that we actually have a lot more overlap than we might have thought, and that nobody is or should be advocating for anything remotely resembling the status quo. Whatever happens in the future, whether it involves no animals, which is my preference, or very few animals, which some people prefer, either one is going to have animals at most at the margins of our food system. And so I think that if we organize around that idea, that animals should be taken away from the center of our food system, and we should be aiming for an almost entirely or entirely plant-based future, then we can build coalitions and make a lot of progress towards shared goals. Now, I think similar debates can arise with respect to the paths that we take towards those goals. For example, people will often debate between so-called revolutionary or reformist, confrontational versus non-confrontational, radical versus moderate, structural versus individual change. These are all ways that we divide ourselves up as advocates and say what kind of advocate we are and what kind of advocacy we think is ethical and effective. And here too, there are real debates to be had. But here too, I think that simplistic and reductive and sort of either or thinking can get us into trouble. And so let me give a couple of examples of that. Consider debates about radical versus moderate activism. I think people who support radical activism, people who say we really need radical change and who are willing to say that plainly and if needed confrontationally, they think that moderate, or they often think that moderate advocacy is ineffective and counterproductive and unethical, because while it might seem to be effective in the moment because you can be relatable and not be alienating and you can get people on your side, it might do more harm than good in the long run, because what you have to do in order to be relatable and non-alienating is you basically have to be non-threatening. You have to say that you value a lot about the status quo, and you have to convince people that you think a lot about the status quo is acceptable, and celebrate people for participating in Meatless Monday and slightly reducing meat consumption, or celebrate companies for making cages 6 inches bigger. And there's a real risk that all that does is humane washes or greenwashes a fundamentally unjust status quo, thereby reinforcing the status quo and not ultimately taking us to the liberatory future that we want to go to. But then on the other hand, a moderate activist might worry that radical activists are, while yes, being bold and aspirational, also being utopian and alienating, advocating for a goal that is not going to be achievable at present, and alienating a lot of people in the process and destroying our opportunity to build coalitions with people who might partly but not fully agree with us. And so then moderates think that the radicals are actually doing ineffective and counterproductive activism. And here, I as with everything, I think that there are reasonable points being made on both sides of this debate. And what we find is that if we take a systems approach where we have a broad pluralistic movement that involves a division of labor between moderate and radical activists, we can make much more progress overall than if everybody was doing one or the other type of activism and advocacy. If we have this systems approach, then, for example, radical activists in making bold and aspirational claims about what a just future might look like, they shift the center of the debate, and they pave the way for moderate change by making the moderate position appear to be more moderate and reasonable in comparison. And then when moderate activists actually achieve incremental reforms and meat reduction and bigger cages and so on and so forth, they can shift the goalposts and bring us a little bit closer to the radical goals that we eventually want to be pursuing. And in this way, even though they appear at odds, I think they can often be mutually reinforcing and good to be supporting. And so the question should not really be, should we all be doing radical or moderate activism or advocacy? The question should instead be, what kind of ratio is present in the movement at the moment, and what kind of ratio would be most effective, and how can we redistribute resources and efforts within the movement so that we can achieve a more ideal ratio between moderate and radical activism and advocacy. Similarly, consider debates about individual consumer action versus collective political action. A lot of people have been debating these different theories of change, especially lately. And once again, I think a lot of people are making reasonable points. So a valid critique of the 80s and 90s in animal activism and advocacy is that people were focusing more than they should have been on individual consumer change as a way to achieve animal liberation and a better food system. Because if we say veganism is a moral baseline and everybody should go vegan, and you need to be a vegan in order to have standing in this movement and in order to collaborate with us and participate in our movement, then you are going to alienate people who, for whatever reason, might not be prepared for good or bad reasons, might not be prepared to go vegan yet. And also, you might not be attending to the many structural features of our social and political and economic system that make it difficult for people to produce or consume healthful, sustainable food, like plant-based food. And so in this sort of situation, it really helps to be able to make those sorts of structural changes, and to do that collaboratively, to say whether or not you are currently vegetarian or vegan, please join our efforts to achieve the kinds of structural, social, political, and economic changes that we need in order to make plant-based foods more accessible and affordable and desirable for people, both as producers and consumers. And if we do that, then we might find that more people will choose to become vegetarian or vegan over time. And so I think that is a valid critique of the way that the movement has in the past centered individual consumer change as our path toward a better food system. At the same time, I think there has now been a risk of an overcorrection where people say individual consumer change is futile, is pointless, is a distraction, it does more harm than good, and does not have to be part of what we're doing. And I think that is an overcorrection, because individual action is part of collective action, and the way that we are complicit in harmful systems does shape our psychologies, it shapes our social relationships, it shapes our economic systems. And so I think the right thing to think about this debate is, once again, not that we should be doing individual change or we should be participating in structural political change, but instead we should be considering how our individual actions might be complicit in harmful and oppressive systems, and aspiring to reduce our complicity in harmful or oppressive systems to the degree that we can, while also participating in efforts towards collective action that will bring about structural change that will make those individual actions more accessible and desirable for people in the future. And, we should hold ourselves and others to high ethical standards while also being patient and compassionate with ourselves and each other. Striking those balances is a lot trickier than simply going all in on individual change or structural change, but I think that is the approach that is needed. So finally, let me just say a few words about how I think that we should be thinking about all these issues holistically as we pursue these goals in this broad, pluralistic way. Given how many harms our food system is causing, it can be really tempting to have a division of labor where we each focus on one set of harms and allow other people to focus on other sets of harms. So maybe I focus on the harms that our food system is causing the animals, other people focus on worker exploitation, other people focus on public health harms, other people focus on environmental harms. But if we do that, then there can be really bad substitution effects and counterproductive strategies where people are working against each other. For example, if all I focus on is climate change, I might advocate for beef reduction and not notice if people replace beef with chicken or fish production, which might be better from a climate change standpoint because cows contribute more to climate change than chickens or fishes do, all else equal. But it might be worse from a public health and animal welfare perspective, because these other forms of intensive agriculture amplify the risk of pandemics more and are worse for animals because more individuals are harmed and killed per meal. And vice versa, if I focus only on health, I might be satisfied to replace chicken or fish production with beef production because that is a little bit better from the pandemic risk side, except deforestation creates pandemic risk too. So this is all very complicated, but it might be worse from a climate change perspective. And so I think it really matters to think about all of these issues and impacts holistically, because only when we think about all of them holistically can we think about what sorts of substitutions are not only going to be better from the standpoint of one particular kind of harm, but are also going to be better from the standpoint of all relevant harms, and reduce harm across the board rather than just reduce one kind of harm that I happen to care about and be working on at the expense of increasing unnecessarily types of harms that other people might care about and might be working on. And similarly, we have to think about these welfare and health and environmental impacts, not only holistically within these categories, but also in connection with other broader social and economic and environmental justice questions. For example, there have been moments in the history of the animal advocacy movement when we have attempted to get people to care about animals by blaming workers for animal cruelty, when in fact, workers who are responsible for animal cruelty are also victims of this awfully exploitative animal agricultural system. And really the executives of these industries, but more specifically the policies and these other structural features of the system are the main things that we should be blaming and attending to. And similarly, there are a lot of farmers who might like to be farming other types of foods, but they feel trapped in this system. A lot of workers who might like to be working in other industries, but they feel trapped in this system. And so thinking about how to get from here to where we need to go in a way that is not only good for health, welfare, and the environment at the same time, but also doesn't unjustly blame farmers or workers who are also trapped by this system, and creates pathways for them so that they can access other jobs that are meaningful for them, but also part of more humane and healthful and sustainable food systems or other types of systems is really important. And there are a lot of exciting things happening along these lines right now. So plant-based meat and cultivated meat are picking up momentum, which is wonderful. Many cities are getting involved in these issues. New York City, as part of their NYC Green New Deal, has reduced procurement of beef by 50%, eliminated procurement of processed meat, has meatless Mondays in schools, plant-based clinics in hospitals, all sorts of wonderful stuff like that. At the federal level, Senator Cory Booker and in the House Ro Khanna have introduced a bill that would put a moratorium on the construction of new CAFOs and phase out CAFOs by 2040. So these are factory farms, basically large factory farms, and create a fund that would assist farmers in transitioning away from dependence on industrial animal agriculture. So this is the type of both and holistic structural thinking that I think is going to be helpful for getting us to the future food system we need to go to. And so in closing, I'll just emphasize that we don't yet know exactly what a just ideal future food system would look like, but we do know what we can do as first steps to start getting from here to there. And I think thinking about those goals, where we can find compromise in terms of a future food system that retains some aspects of our current food system, but that replaces our use of animals as a centerpiece of our food system with plant-based foods instead. And that creates a broad, pluralistic, holistic, multi-issue set of social movements that can work together in pursuit of that food system. That is the type of work we should be doing to build coalitions to effectively bring about that kind of change. I'll stop there, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Jeff, and thanks as well for mentioning my piece in the conversation. There's now a couple of questions in the Q&A about in vitro meat and related technologies, and so I'm sure that's something that we can raise in the Q&A a little bit further. But we'll move on to our final speaker first before we get to our discussion session. And our final speaker is Marina Bolotnikova. And she's a journalist. She lives in Madison, Wisconsin, and recently moved there from Boston. Now she's interested, she writes about animals, ideas, and culture. She works as an editor at Harvard Magazine, and she's contributed stories and writing to publications including Vox, Current Affairs, Sentient Media, Tenderly, and a variety of other places. And her work has also been taught at the Harvard Kennedy School. So I'm very pleased to welcome Marina.
Thank you for that introduction, Josh, and good morning, everyone from Madison. I'm so glad and honored to be joining all of you at this urgent and inspiring series. I've learned so much from the previous sessions, and I'm so grateful to Charlotte, Catherine, and Ava for connecting so many people all over the world. It's really an amazing achievement. So I am, just get my presentation going. So I am a journalist, and my interest is in telling stories about the ideas that shape our everyday lives. the hidden, and our shared experiences, the hidden structures and ideas that people are sometimes too in the water to be able to see and confront. So it's not too terribly different from what some people participating in this webinar work on. I wanted to start by acknowledging the presentation made by a participant in this series last month, Joanne MacArthur, the photojournalist who photographs animals experiencing unfathomable suffering all over the world, animals in factory farms, in wildfires and flood events, animals being buried and burned alive by animal industries, animals in all of the directly and indirectly human-created crises that we're talking about in this series. Photography and videography are the primary lens through which members of the public learn about what happens to animals and encounter what happens to animals on our planet. And I actually could hardly bring myself to look at the screen when Joanne was sharing her images because they're so difficult to face. So I've tried to pick some of the less difficult images for this slide. I think these images inspire a sense of tragedy in us. It's not just contextless animal suffering that we're seeing, but it's animal suffering that's part of a story. It's part of a narrative of human domination and human violence against animals. What makes the images so tragic is not merely animal suffering, but it's that people are the ones inflicting violence. I thought Joanne's work would be a useful bridge into something that I want to talk about today, which is the idea of invasive species and the ways in which some animals are imagined to be going places where they don't belong, to be crossing boundaries that we have created for them. And in doing so, they're excuse me, imagined to pose a threat to humans and to the stability, the equilibrium of life on Earth itself. I started to become very interested in this subject a little more than a year ago when I noticed that there was this media narrative about feral hogs. These are animals that number in the millions in North America, and they've proven remarkably successful and adaptable to different environments. As one New York Times story explained, and I'm quoting, "Many experts thought the pigs couldn't thrive in cold climates, but they burrow into the snow in winter, creating so-called pigloos, a tunnel or cave with a foot or two of snow on top for insulation. Many have developed thick coats of fur." What was so remarkable to me about media stories about feral hogs was that they are framed in almost absurdly apocalyptic terms. As the first sentence of that same New York Times story I just quoted from put it, Helena, Montana, ranchers and government officials here are keeping watch on an enemy army gathering to the north along the border with Canada. The invaders are big, testy, tenacious, and they'll eat absolutely anything. In other words, these animals are imagined as literal and enemy invaders that have come to do us harm. The use of military imagery and vocabulary extends so far in discourse about invasive species, it's really remarkable. And I think it's not merely metaphorical, it extends into how these animals are treated. Feral hogs are shot dead from helicopters in Texas. It's really grisly, and there are relatively few limits on hunting them in states where they're prevalent, because extermination is the goal. Although some states that have smaller populations of feral hogs don't permit hunting or have restrictions on hunting, because hunting encourages a culture of hunting the animal to develop, which then encourages people to release more of the animal, this animal for sport hunting, and it encourages the population to grow. So, of course, in the case of feral hogs in particular, you don't have to look far to find out why there is such extreme hostility. It's because they cause economic damage, among other reasons, but economic damage is the main one. And when animals damage economic interests, they are treated ruthlessly. Feral hogs are blamed for billions of dollars a year in crop damage. According to the US Department of Agriculture, an animal who does economic harm or is even likely to cause economic harm is an invasive species. So in other words, an animal only needs to hypothetically have the potential to cause economic damage to be considered invasive. There's also money to be made from exterminating feral hogs, as we see here in this slide. This is just one of many stories you can find about the business of killing hogs. And I just wanted to show you this because it's one of the most surreal things I've ever seen. And this is a hog hunting company in Texas called Hella Bacon. They sell these multi-$1,000 hunting packages to consumers, and I encourage everyone to go to their site to get a sense of the out of this world culture of hunting feral hogs. There is a robust debate in the scientific community, the ecological community, about the invasive species model. I won't comment on that too much today, and that conversation I think is best left to people with scientific expertise. But I do want to flag that it's a conversation that exists and that the usefulness of the invasive species framework is very much a live question. There are many excellent responses to and interpretations of invasive species discourse in animal studies. I've highlighted just a few of them here. I think the idea of invasive species creates a category of animals who are erased as individuals with their own rights and interests and experiences, and it puts humans in a managerial position with respect to all other animals. And of course, it militates against our ability to see humans as the most destructive species on our planet. I love this quote by Manuel de Landa: "Human beings shorten all food chains in the web, eliminate most intermediaries, and focus all biomass flows on themselves. Whenever an outside species tries to insert itself into one of these chains to start the process of complexification, again, it is ruthlessly expunged as a weed." For me, the language of invasive species harmonizes especially well with the framework proposed by Dinesh Wadwell, a critical animal studies scholar at the University of Sydney, in his book, The War Against Animals. This is what I think is one of the most insightful and honest books about the human-animal relationship. Wadwell argues that humans are engaged in a war against non-human animals, not a metaphorical war, but a literal one, that our relationship with animals is, quote, primarily hostile and focused on producing harm and death, total domination and annihilation. It's helpful here to think back to the images captured by Joanne MacArthur, representing the billions upon billions of farm animals tormented in factory farms, scientific and commercial labs, animals experimented on, animals exterminated because they're deemed invasive, and on and on. As Wadwell puts it, and I'm quoting again, certainly taking this grim picture into account, it seems reasonable to suggest that if this mass-scale injury and death is systematic and directed, then perhaps it conforms to an understanding of war. I bring up the model of the war against animals because I think you can't understand our attitudes toward invasive species without understanding the war against animals. If you think about it, the highly militarized, menacing language with which we describe invasive species, it precisely mirrors and affirms the idea that we're at war against them. Remember how wild hogs were described in the New York Times, one of the most prestigious newspapers in the world, as an enemy army gathering along the border with Canada. So if we think about and take seriously the idea of the war against animals, then I think it becomes clear that invasive species are so reviled and seen as deserving no moral consideration whatsoever, because they represent a violation of human sovereignty over animals. Because, in other words, because they're invaders disrupting the equilibrium that we have created for the world. Jeff, Sebo, and I wrote an op-ed about the problem with invasive species rhetoric earlier this year in Sentient Media. And it got an extraordinary response. I believe it was one of their top read pieces this year, and I was really surprised by the reception, both positive and negative. And the massive response to this piece showed me that there's a really important conversation to be had here, and that we have an opportunity as people who think deeply about animals to intervene here. So what I want to do is expand a bit on that conversation and present some ideas for us to think about. So there's currently a massive global shift taking place in the habitats of different species. As the planet warms, the ranges of animal and plant species are moving. We don't know the full extent of how much that's happening, but it's a massive shift. And there's a discussion in the scientific community about how we should think about this unprecedented shift, and to the extent to which it's appropriate to map the idea of invasion onto what I've seen referred to as climate tracking species, or species that are adapting to climate change by changing where they live. At the same time, there's a widely accepted discourse about how invasive species make environmental crises worse, and especially are making the effects of climate change worse. One of the examples Jeff and I mentioned in our piece were Australian feral camels. These are the descendants that were of camels that were brought to Australia, and today they're considered an invasive species and a nuisance, not surprisingly, because these animals consume a lot of food and water. Many of you will have seen the story from earlier this year about the thousands of these camels being shot dead, reportedly because they were searching for water in drought conditions during Australia's extraordinarily severe bushfire season. So that was a kind of a prominent story this year. But camel culls are nothing new. They've happened in Australia before, and they'll certainly continue. One fascinating example of the interface between invasive species and climate change are beavers. So beavers are thought of as an invasive species in parts of the Americas. They've been expanding northward into the warming Arctic as the planet warms. And they're having a bunch of effects on their environment, as beavers do. One research paper from earlier this year suggested that they are hastening the thawing of Arctic permafrost through a complex process in which their dams create larger, deeper water bodies and then flood and warm up nearby tundra. Beavers are in an interesting position in invasive species discussions because they are a species that are thought of as having agency and creativity, right? They're called nature's engineers. And so it's not always reflexively seen as a crisis that they are expanding their range. It's sort of interpreted as, well, that's what beavers do. And the presence of beavers makes an ecosystem newly hospitable to other species as well. We have warm, positive associations toward beavers. And this is what we see in a lot of discourse about beavers. This is a quote by a scientist speaking about beavers in this WBUR news story. Evolution has taught beavers to be almost perfect hydraulic engineers. They know where to put their dams. They are very efficient, and they're incredibly industrious. The journalist Ben Goldfarb has written about the ability of beavers to stave off some of the effects of climate change through their construction of wetlands. They changing their physical environment in a positive way, and that generosity, of course, is not easily extended to an animal like feral hogs, who also show ingenuity in adapting to colder climates, building dwellings to keep warm in the winter. Remember the pigloos. But hogs are so much easier to see as vermin, ultimately because their category for pigs is food animals, in the ideology of carnism that Natalie mentioned in her talk. They belong to both these reviled categories of food animals and invasive species who have no rights whatsoever, even any moral standing whatsoever. They're not even conceived of as having experiences that matter. They're totally erased as living beings. So I think that the mass climate-driven shifts that are taking place across our biosphere that we are only just beginning to understand should be an opportunity to start to unsettle the invasive species paradigm, and to do so in a way that recognizes the agency of animals and recognize that they have legitimate claims to life regardless of where they came from. This leads me to another dimension of the invasive species issue that's crucial to notice. Invasive species are derided and scapegoated in much the same way that human migrants are. So the language and the concepts used to vilify them are remarkably parallel. So invasive species are imagined as promiscuous, hyperfertile, insatiable, as gobbling up resources that rightfully belong to natives. And there's a rich scholarly decolonial approach to thinking about non-native species by Banu Subramaniam and others that I've quoted here. Natalie has just edited a forthcoming book on the subject called Like an Animal, Critical Animal Studies Approaches to Animals, Borders, and Othering, that I'm so excited to read and that I hope everyone here engages with as well. So here I want to suggest that there's an important parallel we should make between human and non-human migrants. Climate refugees is an idea that's already widely used in the media and in discussions about the global burden of accommodating people who are displaced by the climate crisis, though climate refugees aren't recognized in international law because as some people on this call understand far better than I do, the Refugee Convention was designed to help people who are facing acute crises and not the kind of slow rolling disaster that we face in the climate crisis. But there's so much reason to see different animal species as refugees. A wonderful paper made the case for why elephants who cross borders in order to survive and escape persecution deserve to be treated as refugees under the law, except that their species prevents us from seeing them as such. And so I hope it is with so-called invasive species and the many animals who are displaced by climate change and other disasters. And I would argue that we have an extra burden to give special status to animals like feral hogs, who are in the situation that they're in because they were brought to the Americas by Europeans. So invasion, invasive species, refugees, these are all ideas that are associated with war and that are born out of conditions of war. And I think the invasive species framework is an implicit acknowledgement that we are at war with non-human animals. And I think that the climate crisis gives us both the opportunity to disrupt the invasive species narrative and also the obligation to extend refugee status to them as a way of making amends and restitution. And speaking of restitution, as I get to the end here, I want to just say a few words about what will be the place of farm animals in a world after animal agriculture, as the organizers of this series so helpfully asked us to address. So one of my great questions about the post-animal agriculture world that so many of us here dream of is how can we recover spiritually from the massive crime that we've perpetrated against animals? How can we make sure that we tell the truth about it? What kind of stories will we tell about it? How will it be remembered and memorialized? And just as with other atrocities, I think we need to imagine what a truth and reconciliation process will look like after animal agriculture so that we can come to grips with what happened and why, and prevent it from happening again. So, and the idea of healing and making amends for the past, I think is top of mind for a lot of people right now as we think about how America is going to recover from the Trump era. So there are a lot of ideas about this in the air right now that I think we can add to and benefit from. In thinking about this, I've taken a lot of inspiration from Brian Stevenson, who is an extraordinary criminal justice lawyer and activist who writes about how America can reckon with its history of slavery and white supremacy and how it still hasn't done that. He's the author of this extraordinary and well-known book, Just Mercy. And he says something amazing about what it means to recover, to heal from atrocities that has sat in my mind for a long time. He says that although we may live in a moment where we see shame as a bad thing, and think that the way to get people to change their minds is to never make them feel ashamed, he thinks that actually we need to embrace shame and sit with our shame, that it's an important part of the healing process that can't be skipped. So this is what he said in a 2017 podcast interview. I think we, meaning in America, have to increase our shame, and I don't think shame is a bad thing. In faith perspectives, to get to salvation, at least in the Christian tradition, you have to repent. There's no redemption without acknowledgement of sin. It's not bad to repent. It's cleansing. It's necessary. It's ultimately liberating to acknowledge where we were and where we want to go. We haven't done that collectively. And he'll often talk about how Germany, as he sees it, has recovered from its past atrocities, if not completely, better than the US has, because of its willingness to tell the truth and show shame, to memorialize history and build it into the geography of its cities. So it's hard to walk anywhere in a major German city without being confronted by a marker of the past. I love this idea, and I think it really speaks to the difficult emotional work that we're going to have to ask people to do as we move toward a plant-based food system. Brian Stevenson is also led the construction of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Alabama, which is an incredibly moving memorial to African Americans who were victims of lynching. Each of these steel planks that you see represents a county in the US and lists the names of people who were lynched there. Its design almost sort of reminded me of being at the Holocaust Museum in Berlin. So in an imagined future where we no longer raise animals for food, I think we still ought to and need to be confronted by the memory of what we used to do to animals, and to see it as something for which we collectively owe something. We can imagine many creative, moving ways in which animal agriculture or animal exploitation more broadly could be memorialized. We can be inspired by existing memorials to animals, like this wonderful statue of Emily the cow, a dairy cow who escaped a slaughterhouse by leaping over a 5-foot gate and evaded capture by authorities for over a month, and she lived the rest of her life peacefully. I think there's so much potential also for mass memorials to the victims of slaughterhouses, works of art that highlight not just the story of one animal, but invite viewers to try to comprehend the incomprehensible scale of this atrocity. The memorials could be located on the site of former factory farms or slaughterhouses, for example, or even be built into the structure of factory farms so that visitors can experience what these places were. And of course, there will be living liberated farm animals and descendants of farm animals that we will have the obligation to care for. I think the exact scale of that and our ability to accommodate those animals will depend a lot on things that are unpredictable, like the speed with which animal agriculture is phased out. But I think animal farm sanctuaries will continue to be caring for rescued animals for a long time during and after our transition away from animal agriculture. And I think these animals should be absolutely central to our reckoning with the past and the crimes of animal industries. So animals like Finnegan here, who lives at the sanctuary where I volunteer locally, he requires a lot of special attention and care, but he is just one of the kindest and most joyful individuals I know. And I imagine a future in which animals like him are honored and respected and admired for the disabilities that they've been forced to live with, and rather than degraded for them, and a future in which they are revered and honored members of society. And so even though we are so far from the future we want to live in, I'm not naive about that, and I don't know that we'll ever even get there. I think it's important for us to have a future-oriented vision. I think the memory of past victims of animal industries should have a major presence in the world we're trying to build, as should stories about individuals like Finnegan and about Emily the cow and countless others who have defied the brutal, extraordinary barriers they face and have shown creativity and agency and the will to survive. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Marina. I think that those closing thoughts on memory and remembrance offer a really kind of powerful way to round off our three presentations. So we now have a Q&A period and discussion period. So we are roughly aiming for 2 hours. So we're probably looking at about 40 minutes to go. We may go a smidge over that, depending on how the discussion's going. But we've got plenty of time to delve into some questions, though we do have many questions. Now, before I get to the audience questions, Marina, I believe that you have a talking point for the panelists that you wanted to open the conversation with. Oh, and could I also invite the various panelists to reveal themselves, to turn on their mics so that we can look each other in the face while we chat. And Marina, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, I wanted to ask about kind of like the intersection of all of our talks, in particular how so Natalie talked about how animal agriculture and its extraordinary level of resource use is carved out as untouchable and something that can't be changed, while at the same time we scapegoat like smaller populations of animals when it's easy to deem them invasive as threatening scarce resources. That's what I talked about. So I'd love it if one or both of you had thoughts on that.
Okay. I would just start by pointing out that this is one of the strategies for, I guess, addressing uncomfortable observation and uncomfortable realizations that demand change. Change is scary for a lot of people, for everybody, and so that's one side of addressing issues that potentially are less threatening. Issues that are potentially less likely to cause the individual or the group to have to do the hard work of changing in order to adapt to a new environment. So that's one side. Another side is, of course, we tend to think of the human species as a human species with ingrained moral system and being I guess guided by that morality. But as many evolutionary psychologists have pointed out repeatedly, the human species is a disappointing species, meaning that we don't tend to do the things that we kind of think we are doing, or we kind of want other people to think that we are doing these, like the right thing to do, the moral thing to do. And so in that situation, it is much easier, and we see that with consistency, those who are weaker are preyed upon, and those who don't have enough I guess resources and power to defend themselves get abused and get harmed. And so I would see this phenomena from this perspective as the big ag, or the factory farm businesses that have so much money and so much support are really very difficult to take on. And as a result, we see many focusing on the smaller on the smaller example, or the smaller individual, or the smaller, I guess, the less powerful group. And so I would basically approach it from this perspective.
And Jeff, is there anything you'd like to add on that?
I guess I would just briefly say that one link that I think is interesting across these talks, but also maybe even more importantly between this session and some of the other sessions in this webinar series, is that it can be helpful to think about our responsibilities to farmed animals and wild animals at the same time. And I think, Marina, you brought this out really nicely, because while our exploitation and extermination of animals is a major driver of pandemics and climate change, and so we do need to reduce or end our use of animals as part of our mitigation efforts, these global harms will then in turn impact a lot of domesticated and wild animals in much the same way that they will impact human populations. And so we have a responsibility to include non-human animals, domesticated and wild, formerly farmed and wild, or maybe formerly wild animals in our adaptation efforts. And I think Marina provides a lot of really wonderful illustrations of how animals can be impacted by human-caused global health and environmental changes, where those examples span from relatively domesticated animals like currently farmed animals to relatively wild animals like animals living in forests and plains and so on, and figuring out how we can construct shared spaces so that they can be safe for humans and domesticated animals and wild animals, and figuring out how we can acknowledge the history and legacy of human-caused harms against animals, including domesticated and wild animals. Those are all things that we should be thinking about at the same time. And some of the other sessions in this webinar series focus more on the impacts that pandemics and climate change will have on animals, including wild animals. But I really appreciated, Marina, that you brought these things together by showing how we are going to need, as part of like remembering what we have done to animals and making sure that we do not do those things again, how we need to construct these ways of honoring them and protecting them that can apply across the domesticated and wild categories.
Great, thanks. So I'd like to take a question from Sari Collins, which I think is a really great one. I'd love to hear all your thoughts. So thanks for sending this in, Sari. The question is, do you think that it's urgent for people to switch entirely to a plant-based diet to fight climate change? What if they just switch their diet partly? Can we still halt the worst results of climate change? And I'd be quite interested to hear everyone's response to that. Marina, would you like to start?
Yes. Sorry, what was the very first part of the question? Do you think it's what for people?
Do you think it's urgent for people to switch entirely to plant-based diet
to fight climate? I mean, I think I think the main reason to eat an entirely plant-based diet is for, you know, animal rights reasons, not necessarily climate. In terms of climate, you could be, let's say, 99% vegan and you've made almost all of the difference. I mean, I struggle with this question. I think everyone has their own path. For some people, it's easy and doable to sort of to go entirely plant-based and never look back. For other people, say like gradual worked really well for them. I think I like certainly have people who you know in my life who want to be vegan, but say that I really like this one animal-based food, and I think like we shouldn't, if a person can get to a place where they're 95% plant-based, I think that's in North America, I think that's incredible, and I wouldn't begrudge them.
Natalie, do you have anything to add?
Have I answered the question?
Oh, sorry. Yes, absolutely. I was going to pass over to Natalie.
Yes, I think that it's an urgent matter. I think that without switching to a vegan plant-based diet, we may not be able to actually control climate change and this global catastrophe of global warming. I think it's urgent for everybody to start on this road. Now, how much towards switching completely to a vegan diet, whether 100%, whether 85%, how much of that will actually create the conditions that would stop the global warming, that's, you know, the devil is in the details. But I think it's urgent for everybody to not only consider that, but to actually educate themselves on the matter, and to read a lot of the materials and research that is out there, especially the models, the prediction models that try to see how we can do that. As I mentioned in my talk, the fact that we are headed on a path that actually has double the emissions that we agreed to have in the Paris Agreement, one of the major reasons for that is the fact that we continue to consume animal products. And this has a lot of effects towards climate change and global warming that have not been, as I said, have been kind of unreported, and as a result, they are invisible, but they are invisible in our eyes, in the numbers that we're dealing with. They're not invisible in the actual practical, I guess, life on Earth, in what is happening with the greenhouse gas effects. I think this is an urgent matter. I think people should very seriously consider that. I would also urge people to read books that see collapses of human societies, and those animal and plant societies that were living together or around human societies, by Jared Diamond. I think it was called, the book was called Collapse. In that book, he looks at several different scenarios, some of them of successful adaptation of human groups, where they were able to adapt and to change the unfavorable environment conditions that may have been just simply, you know, coming from the environment, or may have been mostly driven by their own practices and what they did to adapt and to survive, and a bunch of other cases where they actually were not able to stave off the collapse of their own society, and as a result, they may have gone to cannibalism, they may have gone to war, and eventually to extinction of the group, or, you know, just the group leaves the kind of environment where they survived. So I really encourage people to get these perspectives, and specifically to think through what scenarios would be most likely to keep us away from going over the edge. And I think without significant, really significant changes to animal agriculture and significant commitment by a lot of people towards eliminating animal products from their diets, I don't think that we can have this cumulative effect of staving off runoff global warming.
Great, thanks. And very quickly, Jeff, is there anything you'd like to add to this?
Yeah, I can be very brief because I know we have a lot of questions to get to. I think that we need to switch to predominantly, if not exclusively, plant-based global food system. We need to reduce animal use by anywhere from 90 to 100% in order to have a sustainable global food system. And I think it should be 100% because we need to be caring about our treatment of the animals too. Whether that means that we should all go vegan right here now is of course a different question, and I think that is a more contextual question. In general, I think a good principle to follow is, to the degree that you can reduce your complicity in unnecessary harm without sacrificing your own basic interests and needs in the process, then you should do that. So for those of us, who are many of us, who can go vegan and still live happy, healthy lives, then I do think that we have a moral responsibility to do that, not as the only thing we do, but as part of a broader set of efforts to participate in this movement to bring about a more just food system. For people who are not in that position, for people who struggle to access affordable, healthful, plant-based foods at present, then they have a responsibility to do what they can, and that might be different from what I have a responsibility to do. So I think that we should all do what we can. And in the meantime, we should all be willing to work with each other. And you know, even if I privately think you should be doing a little bit more than you are with respect to your food ethics, I will still work with you to end factory farming. And probably there are things in my personal ethics that I should be doing better at too. So we can push ourselves, but also be a little bit patient and compassionate and understanding with ourselves and each other at the same time.
Thank you. There's a really wonderful question here from an anonymous attendee for Marina. Marina, I think you've shown some great examples of what journalists shouldn't do or say when covering invasive animals, but I'm wondering if you have specific recommendations for how they can reframe and recontextualize stories about these animals and the idea that they've been scientifically determined to be harmful or unworthy of care.
Yes, yeah, this is a good question. I think the number one thing that I really miss from media reporting on science, and that I wish more reporters were aware of and brought into their stories, is a sense of the fact that there's such a thing as the history of science and the philosophy of science, and that science involves human judgment and a negotiation of commercial interests, political interests, all the stuff that makes up our society doesn't just disappear when it comes to doing science. And so scientific work doesn't always just represent ground truth, certainly like a single scientific paper doesn't. I think we often have a superficial sense of what that means, like, oh, scientists can have implicit bias, or, for example, or even that scientists can be paid by commercial interests to do things like deny climate change or deny the relationship between smoking and cancer. But I think it needs to go much deeper into an awareness of how scientists make truth claims, of how society and science shape and co-create one another, how ideas like invasion are mapped onto animals. Like, that would be my dream for science reporting, to really have an awareness of the history of science and bring it into every story. Like, if every science story had a science historian quoted.
Thank you. That's a really interesting answer. We've had a few questions about something that none of us have talked about today, but I think is worth raising, and that's about religious angles on human relationships with animals and eating habits. So one of the questions was, well, how do we deal with the fact that religion develops a little bit more slowly than some other cultural changes? And so religious ideas about animals can be entrenched, leading to people to perpetuate harmful activities. And another question, which is in some ways the flip side of this, but very much related, is how can we encourage religious leaders to start taking these questions seriously, given that for a lot of people, framing these kinds of questions and issues in religious language is going to be an effective way to encourage change. Natalie, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, that is a wonderful question. I actually was reading previously some of the comments in the Q&A, and I spotted this question, and I thought of myself, I hope Josh brings it up, and there you go. You also thought it was a great question. Yes, this question is really important because of a lot of complicated matters that are intrinsically rooted in religion and also in ideology, just to expound from that. I'm actually currently visiting Lebanon, and I have to admit that a lot of people who are deeply, deeply religious in their language are using so much scientific terminology, so much scientific frameworks and frames and ideas, and are looking for evidence, that I am personally very, very surprised to discover that, and mostly in the younger generations. So to that, I kind of tend to look at that as eventually we would be able to make progress even with people who accept religious explanations and do not tend to believe or trust science-based and evidence-based, research-based explanations, figures and numbers. So I kind of accept that this is a positive path that we see in the future that will happen. A few years ago, there have been actually a lot of discussion about the question of, are we going to overcome religions? Are we going to basically, are we fundamentally religious? And so we never change that. And I kind of tend to believe that there is, a spike in religiosity, but eventually we are going to use more and more, I guess, rational-based approaches to solving problems in the world. So after this kind of long-winded beginning, I think that we can look at how to approach people who are religious and religious leaders from the perspective of basically looking at how we work with ideas, with ideologies, and with language. So there are frameworks and frames that religious people and religion in general uses that is much more difficult for us to basically frame our discourse and our ideas into the same kind of like messages and frames. And we don't have very well, we don't have developed any, I guess, institutions that approach people with religious beliefs in order to create and basically kind of strengthen the pathways that they need in order to understand ideas of climate change or ideas of morality, interspecies morality. And I think that we should really work on that, work on these approaches, and work really significantly towards reaching out. There is, for every audience, there is a way to audience, but we also people have argued that Democrats in the United States are really underdeveloped in the way they frame their ideas. Even though a lot of people in the United States share their ideas, the way they are framed puts them away. Whether in comparison, Republicans have so much experience in selling these ideas. And I think that we may use a similar approach, trying to really understand how to make, quote unquote, sell these ideas to specific audiences and frame them so that these audiences are able not only to understand them, but also to build some of the frames that we work with.
Thanks, Natalie. Jeff, do you have any thoughts on this?
Oh, sure. So I think, of course, I agree with everything that Natalie said, and maybe I would add that it can be useful to keep two things in mind, especially for those of us who are not members of the relevant religions. The first thing to keep in mind is that there are, in almost all major religions, people working from within those religious traditions to promote progressive, liberatory, human and animal rights related interpretations of that religion. And I think it is almost always better to support those efforts rather than attempt to intervene yourself as a cultural outsider. So if you really want to support religions in making moral progress, then I think doing things like amplifying the voices of and raising money and distributing it to people who are working within those traditions to bring about change internally is usually going to be the best thing to do. And fortunately, more groups are starting to use that indirect model rather than trying to go in and, as an outsider, tell people what their own religion commits them to, which is, even if correct, almost always going to be rejected. The other thing I think we should keep in mind is that it can sometimes be tempting to selectively target minoritized cultural and religious practices for blame and punishment. So for example, it can be popular for people in the West to target kosher or halal slaughter and meat and call those cruel and harmful without extending the same analysis to ordinary Western industrial animal agriculture. And I think when you do that, it can rightly be criticized as prejudicial or discriminatory. But if you make a more general analysis according to which industrial animal agriculture, animal cruelty, these public health and environmental harms is wrong, and then you note that this includes the sort of conventional form as well as particular variations, then that is less of a risk. So those are just a couple of things that I would suggest keeping in mind if you are a cultural and religious outsider thinking about ways of engaging with particular cultures and religions around these issues.
Thank you. And briefly, Marina, is there anything you'd like to add to this?
Yeah, I'm glad Jeff brought up the example of activism against kosher and halal slaughter, because I really agree with that, and I think that is that sort of activism is how we like alienate some, religious movements from animal rights. I mean, I think I'm reminded of a piece that ran in The Nation recently that was called like, who decides what Christian values are, or like whose Christian values, something like that. I don't think it's the case that religion and religious texts are inherently right-wing. I think different parts of religion are emphasized as important or interpreted in certain ways by people who benefit from it. Anti-abortion became such a defining part of American Christianity, but that's not inevitable, and it wasn't always that way. I think similarly, redistribution and helping the poor has been de-emphasized as somehow unchristian, I think probably to the confusion of Christians around the world who aren't in America, because our oligarch class realized that they benefit from building this alliance with religious Americans. So I'm Jewish, and in the Jewish community in the United States, I think young progressive Jewish people are doing a lot to change, really change what Judaism in America means, what it stands for. I think that's, and I think all of that is really promising. I don't know, but as for other religious movements, I'm not sure I have a good answer. I think this is a really, really hard question.
Thanks. So I'd like to move on to two big issues that are coming up again and again in the questions. One of them is regenerative agriculture, and we'll get to that in a second. Several people have asked about that, so thank you. The other is in vitro meat or cultured meat. So we've had some questions that are effectively, so what is this exactly? In a sentence, a very quick sentence, the idea is that we can take cells from living animals, and in a laboratory or factory environment, we can grow these cells into meat. So we can create something that is materially just like meat, but it's not from the body of an animal. So it's not just a highly realistic plant-based burger. But then we've also had some very interesting questions about the possible future with cell-based meat. How many animals are there going to be? Is there still going to be farms where these animals live, because we need sources for the cells? But I just want to read out, in the interests of not hiding criticism, I want to read out a comment from John Sanbon-Matsu. So thank you, John, for sending this in, who was quite critical of the pro in vitro meat comments made by myself and by Jeff. So he says, is there no cautionary note whatsoever from panelists about the synthetic/cellular meats juggernaut, which is being driven by venture capitalists? For example, about, ironically, the renaturalization of flesh or meat by cellular meat proponents who tell us that meat is good. And he's quoting me there. And a permanent feature of the human condition. They're not my words, they're his words. I find it shocking how little critical thinking there is about this. I and others have pointed out some of the drawbacks to this technology and the culture around it on cleanmeathawks.com, and that is a very useful website for seeing the kinds of arguments that animal advocates are making against cell-based meat. So I want to invite the panel. Well, first of all, so Jeff, I know you're quite pro in vitro meat, and I've made clear here that I am. Natalie, Marina, are the two of you, where do the two of you stand on this question? Natalie, you first.
So very quickly, in the interest of time, I would like to point out that from the information that I know, I realize that that type of meat would decrease a lot of the greenhouse gases, and would also decrease a lot of the animal suffering that we see currently. So that is really important for me. On the other hand, I am aware that it would not completely eliminate animal suffering. And so that also is something that is very important for me. And so while I believe that it may be a step towards solving some of the problem, is not for me the final solution. And for me, the final solution would have to be something that does not involve animal cruelty. And that solution will have to to basically not involve the exploitation and use of any non-human animals, because in order to provide some of these cells, you need to actually farm and keep some non-human animals.
Thank you. Marina, where do you stand on this issue?
So I'm familiar with the Clean Meat Hoax website, and I've seen all their videos. I think they make a lot of really smart points about how we're literally running out of space on the planet to keep raising more farm animals, and how animal industries are using lab-grown meat as a supplement rather than a replacement for living animals. I mean, on the other hand, I think the future is really unknowable. I think, like, certainly, the future of how lab-grown meat will change our food system is unknowable. I couldn't make a confident, prediction that it's not going to replace animal farming. I think we certainly should have some epistemological humility about our ability to know these things, and so I have to be sympathetic, to efforts to grow meat without killing more animals, because animal agriculture is only, as much as like vegan culture sort of seems to be becoming more influential, more mainstream, we're killing like vastly more animals for food every year in the big picture. So I have to be like sympathetic to something that has the potential to reduce that. I don't think I've heard a response or a satisfying response from lab-grown meat people sorry, I don't know if I'm using the term, if lab-grown meat is the same as if all these things are interchangeable, but that's what I'm using to refer to it. I don't know if I've heard a satisfying answer to the concern about how it does require you to keep, it does require killing living animals to produce lab-grown meat.
Thank you. So if I could just quickly offer a partial response to that. So the technology doesn't, on my understanding, require the killing of animals. Biopsies can be taken. Now, the simple fact is that much of the work that is being done currently, for example, these very famous high-profile cases, they have involved the killing of animals. They've involved animals that have not been treated well in a lot of cases, not in every case. So yes, we can acknowledge those problems there, but I think, so Stephanie Lance in the questions asks how many animals would need to be used, where would they need to be housed, what would happen to them after they are used? And I think those are crucial questions. And in my view, these are questions that require work from social, political and ethical theorists, like the people on this panel, to explore the possibility of what kinds of futures we could imagine incorporating in vitro meat or similar. And so I hear the criticism from the Clean Meat Hawks website that says something to the effect of, well, currently venture capital has a big involvement. We are moving potentially towards a system where the control of the food system is consolidated in the hands of a few capitalists. And I hear that concern, and my response would be, well, let's imagine some alternative futures. So I'm working on some of this in unpublished work, hopefully forthcoming. But there's been some published work, for example, the pig in the backyard model from Clemens Driessen and Cor van der Wiel, two Dutch philosophers, who offer this vision of in vitro meat that moves it away from the kind of worrying visions that motivate many of the critiques. So I realise that I'm not a panellist and I shouldn't be talking too much. So with that in mind, I'd like to pass over to Jeff to ask if he has any thoughts on this.
Yeah, I was going to insist that you talk a little bit about this, so I'm glad that you did. I basically agree with what people have said, and I just want to second Natalie's point that we can distinguish questions about the short and medium term from questions about the long term. I am, and I think we should be agnostic about whether highly processed plant-based meat or cultivated meat have a significant place in an ideal future food system. There are definitely trade-offs involved there, not only in terms of eating what we conceive of as flesh, but also in terms of the energy use and other types of consumption and emissions that would be involved in producing a more processed version of food as opposed to simpler plant-based foods. But in the transition to whatever future food system we ultimately want to bring about, I think that plant-based and cultivated meat are going to be close to essential. And I do really appreciate a lot of the criticisms, the moral, conceptual, linguistic, social, political, economic, technological criticisms that people have offered against both plant-based and cultivated meat. I think they raise very significant questions and concerns, but I think what we should be doing is celebrating and promoting these technologies as serious, short-term, viable alternatives to horrific conventional industrial animal agriculture. And when we look at these questions and concerns, we should use them as opportunities to try to support this in the right ways so that it can steer us in the right directions rather than in the wrong ways, so that we can avoid replicating the mistakes that we have made in the past with, for example, early generation GMOs and that kind of thing.
Thank you. And these are conversations that I hope will be ongoing. And I think this is a wonderful example, incidentally, of a conversation that animal activists, animal ethicists, animal studies scholars are having with each other, right? Because as it happens on this panel, there are people who are quite pro this, but as John has pointed out, there are a lot of respected, capable academics who are challenging this. This is a live debate right now, and it's a live debate that I personally welcome and would like to hear more of. However, we have other questions. So I'd like to move on to the other big question, one of the other big questions that has come up again and again, and that's about regenerative agriculture. So just as an example of the question that's coming up, I want to read out the comments from Raghav Bandari, with apologies if I've pronounced that incorrectly. He says, or she says, I often hear from people that cattle is a necessary part of holistic regenerative farming and mention Alan Savory as their hero. I try to reply to this misconception, like no peer-reviewed study has confirmed Savory's claims, but they are still skeptical of my response. What would you advise is the best way to reply to these kinds of folks? Wonderful talks, thank you. Marina, is this something that you've come across?
Yeah, it's not something I know a ton about, but I think definitely the claim that that animals have to be part of the food system, and that there's a way to do it sustainably is a claim that's often made and rather than justified, like a claim that's often made by people who profit from animal agriculture, like people who are raising animals for food, who are telling us that it's necessary without justification. So I would be very, very, very skeptical of it, and I think there's this is another thing that that the media doesn't do so well. I think when interviewing interviewing regenerative ag people, interviewing people who experiment on animals in labs for a living. I think there's a tendency to defer to what they're saying and not apply the skepticism that I think those claims definitely deserve.
Thank you. Natalie?
Josh, I apologize, but because of some interruptions, I wasn't able to hear the question. Would you mind repeating it?
Yes, basically, it's about regenerative animal agriculture and the idea that animals need to be a part of our food system in order to fight climate change and to preserve soil integrity and similar. Is this something that you've come across? And the question in particular was, how do you think we should respond to these kinds of challenges?
Okay, if I heard you correctly, there was again interruptions, but the idea is whether consumption of non-human animals should be something that we hold on to because somehow it helps with preservation of soil, and I don't think I remember what else was in the question. And
well, if you like, I can come to you first in the next question, and we can move on to Jeff now. Would that be okay?
Okay.
Jeff, have you got any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very complicated issue, and the science is still developing. So I think we should all have a certain degree of humility about what the impacts of regenerative agriculture are. My understanding is that the stated benefits for the environment are still unconfirmed empirically, and so far studies have not really supported the overly optimistic claims about how much regenerative animal agriculture can reduce climate change, to say nothing of significantly mitigating climate change. The main other thing that I would say right now that I feel more confident about is that even if regenerative agriculture can have a place in a future food system from an environmental perspective, setting aside animal welfare and rights perspectives for a moment, though we should never really set those aside, even if it can have a place, it is really crucial to recognize that it would not be scalable and capable of producing anything approaching the amount of non-human animal products that people currently expect to be able to eat. So you would need to consume much more land per animal in order to produce meat through this less intensive kind of agricultural system than through our current highly intensive factory farm system that comes along with all of the harms that we have already discussed. So even if a particular acre of land might be contributing to climate change less, it will also be producing much less protein, and so is not a scalable solution that will be at the center of a sustainable future food system that can feed a rising population of humans. It will at best be a peripheral thing that creates products that some people consume at the margins. That will be at best what it can do, I think.
Thank you. There's another big question that I want to address in a moment, which is about population. We've only got a few minutes left though, so I wanted to get a couple of really quick questions in. So the first one was from an anonymous attendee, which I think is a great question. Is there any sort of initiative to halt or minimize animal agriculture, in particular as it relates to the spread of COVID-19? Now, I'd like to quickly plug the Anti-Pandemic Diet website and project, which is being run by Cheryl Abate, who is an American philosopher who knows a great deal about this. But Natalie, do you know of any work in this area or any campaigns in this area?
The only thing that I'm aware of, which comes from a scientific side related to COVID-19, is a new book that Dr. Michael Greger and his team of researchers, medical researchers, he's the author. He just published How Not to Die in a Pandemic. I think that was basically the name of the book. And it has a lot of details about diet and which diets are those that support, basically people not getting sick from different pandemics, and also diets that support us from developing new strains of new viruses and therefore new pandemics. But this question is really related to also to not just to pandemics, but also to global warming. And there have been published research that at least call for government initiatives that invest in transition programs with farmers, animal farmers, to become plant crop farmers. There was this article by a scholar called Lowry, we can think about that as kind of a new rural America, so to speak. Also, I expect that as scientists, we will see a lot of grants that are going to be offered to study alternative production of protein, or investment and consumption of plant protein is going to increase. I mean, right now, meat increase is at 2% per year, and plant protein increase is at 15%. And in a few years, in 5 years or something, it was, I guess, it was up to, I think, 20 to 30% increase from previous levels, global levels. Actually, I think that's way more that I'm quoting right now. Probably the figure I'm quoting is just a little bit is less than I've read and remember. But in general, I think that investment will play a huge role, and also research will be funded for scientists to explore new alternatives, including new alternatives to stave off pandemics in the future.
Great, thanks. Jeff, anything to add?
I mean, there are definitely a lot of exciting things happening. There is a lot of great activism. People can Google the Animals Manifesto, which is a really nice collaborative document that connects animals and COVID-19 and pandemics. A lot of other people are doing similar work, and then people are trying to leverage that to create policy change at the city, state, and federal level in the United States, and in parallel ways in other countries. But rather than go into more detail about those things right now, in the interest of time, I'm happy to go along to whatever the next question is, so we can fit one or two more in if possible.
Great. And just very quickly, Marina, anything on this question before I move on to the next one?
Well, in terms of a movement away from animal agriculture in light of the pandemic, I think when a lot of the same suspects have sort of like told us after the pandemic hit that hello, this is because we raise so many animals for food, and a lot of like those who have always resisted those ideas have continued to pretend that that's not the issue here. I would highlight those of you who are in the UK are probably familiar with Animal Rebellion. It's a movement that connects animal liberation and the climate change goals of Extinction Rebellion in a really, I think, like exciting, fresh, smart way. I really wish we had a prominent movement that big in the States. So I would really encourage people to read the language that Animal Rebellion uses around this in their organizing.
Thank you. So we do have a number of interesting questions left, but I feel we're going to have to focus on one big one, which is something that several people have raised. So the suggestion's been made, I can't remember who I'm quoting now, but it was someone in the questions, that the elephant in the room here is human population growth. Natalie, do you believe that human population growth is the elephant in the room when it comes to climate change?
I think a lot of that has significance, because as human population grows, and if we continue the majority of the human species continues to espouse carnism as their primary ideology through which they see the world and understand their relationship with the planet and with other animals, I believe that the demand for non-human meat is going to decrease just by sheer numbers. And so that will have a very, very dangerous effect on the planet, on other animals, and also on the human species.
Thank you. Marina?
I would be really really wary of discourse about overpopulation and you know, and obviously because of its past relationships with eugenics and colonialism, and I think it's you know, I think it's unlikely to be effective too. I think we have to give you know, like people a positive vision for what the future could be, where they could, you know, where they can have children, you know, have lives on a livable planet, you know, and still have lives that they can enjoy and have hope if we're like if you know, if we're really going to have any chance of pushing back the climate crisis. Does that make sense?
It does. And Jeff, have you got any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, as a general point, I would say there is no the key to solving climate change. There are a million things happening at the same time, all of which are contributing to climate change and other global catastrophic threats that are primarily human caused. Certainly, if we had a lower human population, then all else equal, we would be consuming and producing less, and climate change might be less of a risk. But to focus on population as the driver probably is reductive, because it neglects how much consumption per capita is also a major contributor. My dog is asking for FOD, sorry for background noise. And as Marina says, because of the way that it sets up potentially harmful and oppressive political responses to population increase, and because it distributes blame for these problems in a suboptimal way, right? Climate change and other major global changes are predominantly caused by, you know, the wealthy 1% of industrialized nations, whereas population rise might be happening most in other regions. And so to focus mostly on population neglects where these harms are happening most. And so I certainly think that we should talk about population, but we should talk about it in context, and we should be sensitive to the ways that discourse can be exploited or weaponized to support harmful types of policies or reductive types of policies. And then the last point that I'll make is, remember what this session is about. This session is about the fact that we kill an estimated 100 billion farmed animals per year. The farmed animal population annually substantially outweighs the current human population. And so if we are concerned about population control, then I think the first thing to do is ethically and effectively reduce the population of farmed animals who are being exploited and harmed and killed for human benefit, and who do not really have lives that are meaningful or valuable for them in the process.
Thank you. Now, we are rapidly running out of time. And although we're coming to the end of this session, I'd just like to say to everyone who's joined us, this doesn't have to be the end of the conversation, right? You are very welcome to drop me a line by email. You can find my email online if you want to continue talking about any of these things. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm new to Twitter, and it's a great place for having these kinds of conversations. And I'd just like to give a little shout out to a podcast which I run at the moment called Knowing Animals, which is a great place for conversations about human-animal relationships. So I do encourage you to continue thinking about these kinds of things, and to continue engaging with me and with us potentially about these things. We're sorry we didn't get to every question, but we are in an interesting position. Well, so several people have said, oh, would you be interested in getting involved with this? Would you be interested in talking more about this? And those are the kinds of things I'd be happy to receive in my inbox and have a conversation with you about. So bearing in mind that we're just coming to the end, I just wanted to offer each of our speakers a quick chance to say anything they'd missed, or to say goodbye, or what have you. So Jeff, you're on my screen. Would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. So as you say, obviously this conversation only scratched the surface, and each of us was only able to talk about one angle very briefly. And there is a lot more to say, as I can see from all the really great questions that people have been asking, the vast majority of which we were not able to get to. So I just want to second what Josh said along with my dog. I want to second what Josh said, which is that I am very happy to continue the conversation with anybody and have you offer objections or criticisms or anything along those lines. So please feel free to reach out to me at any time at jeffsebo@gmail.com or nyu.edu or Twitter, Facebook, whatever. And I would love to talk more with people. And thank you to the organizers and to Josh and to my co-panelists also.
Marina?
Yeah, I echo all of that. We've covered a lot, but you can go so much deeper on everything we've talked about. And I know that challenging the idea of invasive species is something that a lot of people probably aren't familiar with, even people in the animal rights world. So I would be really glad to keep engaging on it on Twitter, over email, or whatever. I look forward to continuing to working on it and talking to all of you.
Great, thank you. And Natalie?
And I also want to chime in and say a huge thank you to the organizers. I am absolutely amazed at the fantastic topics that were posed over several different sessions, and also of the amount of development and the fantastic website, and also the fact that all these videos are available for everybody to see, even if they were not able to make it to one of the presentations. I want to thank you to the vast amount of people who today came to hear us, and thank you so much for the wonderful questions. I am going to copy and paste all the Q&A and read them later. If you would like to ask any questions after this is over, please, you can email me, just Google me at the Georgia Tech, and you will be able to find my email address. Thank you so much, Josh, for organizing, for being the moderator, and Marina and Jeff, thank you for helping answer these questions.
Great. Well, thank you, panelists, and thank you, audience, and thank you, organizers. This is goodbye from me, but I'm just going to quickly pass over to Charlotte, who's got a few comments about this series more widely. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you so much, Josh. This has been an absolutely terrific session for me. It's been so interesting to follow your conversations and how you dealt with the many questions that we got. A big thank you from my side to all the speakers. I really enjoyed listening to what you had to say about this really urgent topic. Some very, very thoughtful contributions, which I highly appreciate. Also reminders that we always interact respectfully. We had several issues going on here, a memorial, analogies to human oppression and exploitation. So it was really interesting to see how you navigated that. Thank you so much for this. And not the least, I want to thank all the people who took their time to tune in today. I know you're from several parts of the world. We can't see you, but we feel you. We've been greatly responsive, and we really appreciated that. This has been a fantastic session. I'm just gonna add our website here, where you can access all of the speakers that and of course speakers and moderators today. By the way, Josh, you've done a terrific job, and I love the fact that you gave everyone a voice at the end of the panel as well, which I really appreciated. So there's the website, and that's also where you get to all the bios of the speakers today, and some info about how you can reach them is available there too. Anyone who wasn't able to make it or would like to, read, listen, or understand some of the things that have been said, since many things were going on today, that would be a great way of accessing that. Since we're uploading all the videos, our next session will be on January 21st. So we have a break of more than 1.5 months. I think it's due. All of us need a break from the COVID restrictions that we're facing and stress at work. So on January 21st, we'll talk about the future of animal politics in the context of climate change, COVID-19, and movements against racial capitalism. It's going to be a very exciting panel, and I hope to see and hear you all then. Thank you so much, and have a good night, morning, afternoon, or evening. Bye-bye.